So anyway, I wanted to talk about the project that I've been working on, and this project started about, I guess it's been about a year and 3 months ago. And the project Transmutation started when I became ill from my HIV status and the medicines that I was put on, and I couldn't function anymore. And so in the process of being really, really ill and not being able to actually produce work, I started to have these very intense dreams about the way that I was working, my processes and things. And what ended up occurring in that time was that I started to use what little energy I had, and I went back out into the streets, and I started to pull paper from the walls, whereas before I was really just more documenting the tears in the paper and the textures that were existing in the street. At that point, and reality or not, in my mind, I felt like I was dying. So, and I felt like I had nothing to lose. And I think that was a very pivotal moment for me, because I was able to break down the barriers that kept me from interacting with the paper. And one day I took down this huge wall right on Insurgentes in Mexico City. And it was the most cathartic experience. I've always found that I'm a very tactile person. And so the experience of ripping the paper and forming the compositions, and I, took my bottle of water and a bottle of alcohol with me, and the effects of how the water and the alcohol and all these different things started to interact with the paper and create transparency between the layers and pull the inks from the other layers forward, became a really powerful experience for me. But at the same time, I was looking for examples. I was having all these strange experiences where I had sort of programmed myself or put the intention in front of myself to listen to what the universe was saying to me. And so I was looking for those voices, those people who were talking to me in the paper itself. And so what had been more about abstraction and color and texture before that became more about the figurative elements that were emerging from the paper as well, and those relationships that I was having with the paper. So
nice.
It was very powerful for me, because at that time too, I was so isolated in my own mental state that it was a way for me to connect back with reality and acknowledge the people who were coming into my life in positive and in negative ways. So positive would be like examples of people in the community who were supporting me and checking in with me, and maybe coming to walk my dog for me, or get me some groceries, or my mother flying from the United States to be with me. All those sorts of things were affecting me. But also there was a lot of because I was being so forward about my HIV status, I was getting a lot of trolling and hate sort of responses from people. And so at that time too, I was listening to what those people were saying, and I was thinking, okay, well, I think there's a positive aspect to what the negative comments were as well. And I have always said that, if somebody tells you to, fuck you, like 10% of that belongs to me. So I have to understand, well, what was it I was doing, that required that kind of response, or, that's not, it's not necessarily 100% true, because there's plenty of people with mental illness out there just spewing things at you all the time, as we all know if we're on Facebook or Twitter or any of those. You kind of open yourself up to it when you participate in that way. So, but I felt like there were messages that I needed to hear, and inside of that stigma that was being projected upon me, and I want to say even there was a stigma from people who were HIV positive as well. And the way that portrayed itself is that there were people who refused to acknowledge that I could have my own experience of the transformation of becoming positive. And because they had this experience where they took medicine and everything was fine, and I was having the opposite experience where I lost like almost 60 pounds in 3 months and had no energy, it was more like chemo for me. They would say things to me like, oh, HIV is the best best gift I've ever received in my life, which to me was like the most insane thing that you could possibly say to someone. I'm like, really? HIV is a gift? I'm like, because as far as I'm concerned, there are medicines for treatment and miracles like that out there, but also there are side effects from the medicine, and long term, there are effects from taking that kind of medicine long term. So the life expectancy was a major concern for me, and the quality of life was a major concern for me. So that started to be expressed through the artwork. And in those times, I was, out there pulling paper and taking down walls of paper and, having these experiences and things, and in small chunks, because for a very long time, it seemed like I could go out for an hour and I could work, and then I would have to, gather the paper up and call an Uber and get it back to my place. And then I'd sleep for a couple of days, and then I would go back outside and attempt to work again. So I was getting very small windows of time where I could work. And then I was able to, write more and kind of go through the process in that method. And then things started to come together over a little bit of time. And I started to exhibit the work, and then the experience of exhibiting the work and having people reflect back things to me also started to change my relationship to the work. So it was a dark time, but it was also a time in which a lot of things evolved for me in terms of what was happening in my studio. The opportunity, I've always referred to things as opportunities, and I wanted to make sure that I engaged it. I was for certain that I was not going to survive the experience. So there was like this sort of, I don't know, like a compulsion to create that came from it. And I think what's interesting right now is, like, with the pandemic, I sort of feel like I was having this individual experience and the whole world was happening around me. And there was a lot of like non-acknowledgement of like what was happening in my experience, but now the whole world is going through this sort of transmutation with the coronavirus, and people are having the stigmas and the emotions around this transformation of how the medicines and virus and all these different things affect us. But the stigma is out there. We see it already. We see like a rise in violence and hate crimes against Chinese people in the United States, based on this idea that they somehow brought it to us and everything. We don't need to debate the logic of that, or the xenophobia behind those sort of messages. But there is a connection between the pandemia of AIDS in the 80s and 90s, and the way that I experienced that, and what is occurring right now on a global scale. So, and I came out in 1987, and the community that I came out into, most of the people that I was connected with at that time did not survive. And I, went to New York, and I went to San Francisco, and I went to Seattle, and, all these places that I kept, I think, as I was very young, and I think I was running from one thing to the other, and you could escape it for a certain amount of time. And then the reality of the AIDS pandemic sort of creeped into your life, back into your life again. And here with the coronavirus, you can't really escape it. It's kind of, it's everywhere. We're all experiencing it. And, there's a sort of paranoia in the streets, the way that people approach each other. And, a lot of people in my neighborhood, I don't know about others, are not wearing masks and things like that. So I get these like stares that, I'm thinking, wow, very, very interesting. These last summer I applied to and was accepted into the Mexicranio project. And so the work that I was doing was being transformed, because I stopped where I was, and I had to figure out how to apply this concept of mine to a three-dimensional object. This is a mini version. There's a medium-sized version behind me I'll show you. And this is where I started to hone the technique, because prior, when I was working on top of a photograph of the color and texture. And in this instance, I actually started, instead of deconstructing, I was actually constructing onto the surface of a three-dimensional object. And the chronio itself was quite large. I mean, it was gargantuan. It didn't fit through the door of the studio, and the studio door is quite large. So I was working outdoors during that project to create it on this grand scale. It took about 6 weeks to accomplish it, and then it took probably about 2 weeks for it to be destroyed in the streets by people. And then I got the opportunity to redo it again. And I refer to that as an opportunity because it's very rare that you get to produce a project on that scale in the public, and then you get to go back and apply all the lessons learned from the process again to redo it. So for me, it was very important to redo it because the chronios travel the world, and I didn't want my work to be misrepresented by the damaged pieces.
Right.
So I spent that time redoing it, and that took until about the beginning of February to finish. And I was super happy to be done with it because as much as I liked the opportunity, it was also distracting me from the next phase of my work that I put on hold. So in the process of doing the chronio, I had started to realize that it was possible to construct the images as well as deconstruct them, but also the concept of the seed came out of it, because transmutation refers to the changes physically and mentally that occurred to me because of stigma, medications, internal stigma for HIV. All these different elements were changing me, and I was evolving into something different. And then I started to remove these circles, and I refer to those as seeds, and that's what this is here. These are semillas. And the thing that I really wanted to experiment with was how to create that layering, which here is quite flat, and then to create some dimension within that layering. And so I was playing with all these different varnishes and things, but then I discovered this epoxy resin. And what I love about the epoxy resin is it's this thick, viscous, super sticky. Like I'm not going to be able to do fingerprints for probably the rest of my life because I've had so much epoxy on my fingertips. But what you see inside of this is there are layers, and it's the ability to layer in new pieces of painted paper and create some dimension. The goal of these particular semillas is to return them to the streets and install them in these zones where the paper came from. And there's this backside of the paper, which you could see is a very sort of fleshy tone. So whereas the front of the paper is vibrant and worn with the colors and things, this has a very different kind of tone to it. And I installed the entire back wall back here with the paper because it's sort of it's like a way of sketching. And the idea was to take this into a full installation in a gallery space or somewhere where these papers become tiled on the wall, and the seeds would be displayed with the paper flipped. So in the streets, I might go in and cut out a square, flip it around, glue it back into the wall, and then install a seed on top of it. So to me, it's the full life cycle of the paper.
Cool.
The problem I've run into is I'm so attached to my seeds that I don't want to install them in the street. I know, I gotta let it go. Gotta let that go. It's hilarious to me that that's my problem. But you know, I get emotionally attached to my work, and then you know, so there are all these different seeds. This one is a little bit more reflective because of the epoxy. And what I've been doing is going back in with a flat varnish. The flat varnish that I use is quite expensive and not available in Mexico. So whereas before I was using it, like even on the Cranio, on the huge Cranio, I went through gallons of it. Now I'm being very particular about the way I use it and using other mediums to do the in-between layers. So, but if you see, you could see the gold circles on the pieces. And this is a new addition. And the reason I decided to add these gold circles is to represent the spikes on the viral cell. And we've been seeing that a lot with coronavirus, but the HIV virus is the same version of this. So I wanted to give a metaphorical representation of the coronavirus and the connection to HIV and that stigma. So these gold circles are appearing in all the pieces. I'm only doing it on the background pieces, not on the foreground pieces. So, because I want the figures to exist in these spaces, the representation of the human to exist in these spaces where the virus exists as well. So right now I have 4 of the semillas completed. And
nice.
I have several, like 20 more in process. This process at this scale takes about a week and a half to 2 weeks because of all the layering. Things have to dry in between for it to come together. And then I've been working on these smaller pieces as well. Right now, I have to balance the larger scale work with the small scale work. I don't know how you guys are all doing during the time of the pandemic, but I have these days where I'm so anxious from seeing the news or something like that, which I'm trying to avoid. I assume at this point that if the world is going to end, I'll probably hear about it through other channels. So I've stopped like really paying attention to the news because it raises my anxiety. And that doesn't help me be productive at all in my studio.